Okay, guys, first of all, wow, it's loud. First of all, it's an honor, and I hope I can measure up. We have a auspicious room of guys with a huge technical knowledge, and I've been working on this for a while, and I'd like to make this more of an open forum and cooperative presentation. So feel free to interrupt me at any point. Ask questions. I'll try to elucidate any points a little bit further. And I think we'll just have a ton of fun. Stop working. I'm going to skip two. There we go. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of FT8. Over Christmas, it didn't look like there was going to be much exciting DX going on. And I'll tell you, it's been just great over the last month. We had Desecheo Island, KP5/NP3VI. We had a wonderful DX expedition, J51 Alpha Guinea-Bissau, and 3Y0K. As always, FTA figured very, very prominently in all of these D expeditions, surprisingly so in 3Y0K, where 62% of 3Y0Ks were FTA QSOs. We have a bunch of new ones that are starting or have just started over the last few days, including Bangladesh S2, which is coming on. I worked at Cal this morning on CW, which was a new mode for me, surprising. But anyway, we have a lot of fun ahead of us. Now, what we've all noticed during these landmark D expeditions in KP5 NP3VI, that was probably the first major QRP D expedition. And we saw huge possibilities here for the chances of activating remote Pacific islands with environmental strictures on them that made it difficult until now. J51A, 255,000 QSOs. That's a new world record. And these guys did a great job. They have my nomination for Best D Expedition of the Year. So let's keep on going. So WSJT was introduced in 2001 by Joe Taylor. Joe Taylor is a Nobel Prize winning physicist who basically described a double system with a pulsar in it back about 40 years ago and proved the existence of gravitational waves. That went backwards. So this is going crazy. Hi, Paul. That was supposed to pop up quite yet. There. Okay. WSJTX, the current suite of programs, was introduced in 2017 and included FT8. There was a rapid adoption during the sunspot minimum. And I remember getting into FT8. I had just become active in ham radio again back around this time. And there was a rapid adoption of FT8 because now ordinary people could, for the first time, with QRP and a modest antenna, work DX and work DXCC in a matter of a few weeks. Nowadays, with the current versions of WSJT and JTDX, which both use multi-threaded technology, the hardware is suddenly important. Until this time, you could get away with just a Raspberry Pi and have a perfectly good FT8 station and do well. But suddenly, the guys that spend more money on computers are going to be able to decode weaker ones, decode stations that are buried under layers of QRM. Minimum software requirements, again, are the WSJT program. We'll go over that later on. A net time protocol, what I call the net time protocol tweaker, or a way to adjust it for DX stations that are off kilter. And then a time checking program so you can be sure that everything is okay. Option one, you have a million different things: JT alert, attacker, PSK reporter, DXW. You're all familiar with those. There's a choice of WSJT version. The big change occurred between 2.7 and 3.0. There was a parallel track of WSJT development called WSJT Improved, run by Uwe Riese. So version 2.7 Improved included for the first time a multi-threaded decoder. Up till that point, the only multi-threaded decoder was available in JTDX. By the time we get to 3.0, both 3.0 Improved as well as regular old 3.2 general release, both contain a multi-threaded decoder. And this is the big change, especially for us DXers. There's a version out now called 3.1, which includes FT8, which is a non-automated version of decodium. And my only comment to that is just meh. I don't have a lot of interest in it. We'll also talk today about the various DXpedition modes, the first one described by Joe Taylor in 2018, and the differences between WSJT, Foxhound, and MSHV. And we want to go over examples of both good and bad techniques. Now, the one thing that everyone commented on during this recent flurry of DXpeditions is how many people did seem to be aware of whether it was Foxhound or MSHV, and did seem to be aware of the differences between the two, and were making mistakes that could have cost them their ADNO. So I think it's important to go through all the possible things you can do wrong. We've all done them. I did them myself during this spate of DXpeditions. But I think it's important that everyone understand the difference between these and look at everything and absorb all the information that can be had by looking at the decoding screen. So here is a happy FT8 user. This is Paul at about 3 in the morning in the Tomoto province, busy working. Somebody else was asleep, so there were 2 stations available. So Paul is happily working 2 WSJT and Foxhounds simultaneously at 3 in the morning, and he's still awake. And it's important to recognize that WSJT Foxhound requires involvement. It requires active management. The queue has to be maintained. You have to make decisions as to the number of streams based on what you're actually seeing. This is different than MSHV, where you see the robot stuck at 3 in the morning. Paul's asleep, and if he was using a robot, the robot would just be calling the same station for 3 hours at a time because it hasn't heard a response. So Paul's doing things the right way. So again, FT8 was developed to improve on the slow speed modes that existed for EME, things like that, prior to 2017. It was specifically designed as a fast mode, and it was designed mainly for 6 meters sporadic E. The idea of it being so popular at HF was almost unexpected. It was introduced as part of the WSJTX software package, version 1.8, or now it's 3.0, 3.1. So that was version 1.8 back in 2017. FT8 uses 8 frequency shift keying. Each of the tones is spaced 6.25 hertz apart. You add 8 times that, and you have 50 cycles. That 50 hertz is the bandwidth of an FT8 string. It's a synchronous mode. Signals can be decoded down to 21 or 22 decibels below the relative noise floor of a 2.5 kilohertz bandwidth. So you have some advantages in the sense that this is only 50 hertz wide, so you have a huge noise advantage in that. And we'll talk a little bit later about that. Anyway, within 2 years of release, it became the most used digital mode on HF bands. FT8 is a disruptive technology. It made a huge change in amateur radio. And you could say that in a way, it was as disruptive as the spark to continuous wave transition or the AM to single sideband transition. I I was there at the AM to single sideband trend, but I was not there at the Spark to CW. This describes the relative sensitivities relative to a 2500 hertz bandwidth. Sideband, you require a signal of +10 to +15 decibels over the noise for intelligibility. The S unit is 6 dB. So what this is saying, you need about an S1.5 to 2 signal for your brain to decode what is being said on sideband. CW, -12 to -15 decibels. Again, narrow bandwidth, and biologically, our brains can distinguish a sine wave tone buried deep in the noise pretty darn well, especially after you practiced for a while at 3 in the morning on a D expedition. CW, FT4 -17 or thereabouts. This is probably a little bit optimistic. I've seen 17 decibel decodes using WSJT 3.0 improved, but with the old 2.7, you'll be lucky to see 14 or 15. All of these numbers are approximate and have not really been quantitated precisely. Super Fox, 17 again, optimistic. Probably 15 is a little more run of the mill, although I've seen -17 and -18 decodes on Super Fox. But Super Fox has other issues in the sense that because it's a broad bandwidth mode, it's susceptible to noise and it's susceptible to DQRM, which has become a big problem. In terms of multi-stream FT8 performance, when you drop from one stream to 2 streams, the entire game changes because a single stream FT8 is just like a carrier. Really simple. Your amplifier can put out 1500 watts. You can put out 1500 watts as long as you have adequate cooling, and your amplifier is rated for that. But by the time you go to 2 streams, now you have 2 independent carriers. And at some point or another, those independent carriers are going to either cause destructive or constructive interference with each other. When they're causing constructive interference with each other, all of a sudden, your instantaneous audio voltage is now 6 dB or 4 times higher. So in order to maintain operation within your operating envelope, within the headroom of both your audio chain and RF chain, the FT8 program, WSJT, actually reduces the output voltage of the signal that you're sending to your radio by 6 decibels. So even though intuitively, at least in my P brain, it would seem that you would lose 3 dB, you lose 6 dB. And you can see this graphically when you're working at the expedition and suddenly there are greater and greater numbers of callers, and they suddenly go to 2 streams and just drop away. They drop out of nothing. With each additional stream that you add, you lose roughly another 3 decibels. So by the time you get down to 5 streams, you have a -14 decibel disadvantage compared to a single stream FT8. Super Fox is decodable down to about 15 decibels. But again, it's also a little, so it's about equivalent to a 2-stream FT8 signal. But it's a little bit more susceptible to noise and interference. Personally, I think it should be used more often than it is. I think we'd really like it, but I think when the choice comes between 2 streams or Super Fox, I think a lot of operations should go over to Super Fox. We're going to be seeing that with at least some of the current operations, we hope. But I think Super Fox needs a chance to prove itself. Here are the mode usage trends. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see that back in 2014, 2016, and probably for about 40 years prior to that, sideband 50 to 55%, CW 35 to 40%, and FT8 digital, which in this case is really just RTTY, 5%. By the time you come to 2017, mid-year, we have the introduction of FT8, and we have people going over to the dark side and going on to FT8. By 2018, you can see that now FT8 is now at 24%, and both sideband and CW have suffered because of it. Let me go on to the next slide because I'm not sure I trust all these slides. These are all from ClubLog. And remember, not everybody uploads to ClubLog, mainly just serious operators. So here's ClubLog from 2017. Here we see the introduction of FT8. And FT8 spikes up. It flattens here. I suspect this is contest season. And at that point, there weren't any digital contests. So here are people doing the DX contest, and then it spikes back up again. And I think it's doing that at the expense of phone, which has gone down, except for this little spike, which probably corresponds to CTU sideband contest, and CW. There's a spike down there in CW because suddenly CW, which had been the mode for little pistols, the mode that I used when I was 13 years old to work DX, suddenly it was being surpassed by FT8. Now, the old requirements for a station in FT8 and the new requirements for a station in FT8. I mean, pretty much all you needed was a sideband rig. If it did not have a USB sound card built into it, you could buy an inexpensive Signal Link or DigiRig. Of course, you needed an antenna, and of course, you needed power. Minimum computer requirements were just a Raspberry Pi or Windows 7. Pretty much anything worked because it was not a hardware-intensive mode. In the meanwhile, though, WSJTX 2.7 improved and 3.0 general release, as well as JTDX came out. And all of these modes rely on, including JTDX, rely on a multi-threaded FT8 decoder. This is where, and we can go over this a lot more later on, the single-threaded decoder typically does a continual decoding run on the entire FT8 spectrum. It decodes the strong signals, and it generates a negative digital record of those and uses it to subtract them from the signal itself. At that point, though, now you have the weaker signals, and this can now be split, and of course with 3.0, it can be split in up to 12 segments, and each one of those 12 segments can be assigned to a separate thread. So if you don't have 12 threads, you're not going to be able to complete the decode in time. You're facing a race against time because the decoding is going to start when everything has been received. And you only have 2 to 3 seconds before the next information packet comes in. So to use WSJT 3.0, you need a CPU with at least 4 to 8 physical cores, meaning probably 8 to 16 threads. It needs to be fairly high frequency. You need a minimum amount of RAM. It says 8 gig. You probably are a lot better off with 16 gigs because the decoded signal, the audio signal that's presented to the Fourier transform is stored in RAM. And if you don't have enough RAM, there's an exchange that occurs between your RAM and your solid state hard drive with a substitution between the two, which slows things down. And we'll talk about how to figure out where to put your settings to get the best possible decoding. A solid state drive is essential. A magnetic drive is not going to go fast enough for you. And sound card is the same old thing, 48 kilohertz, sampling rate, DVD quality. I think everybody's accepted that one. But for the first time, the computer hardware actually makes a difference in whether you're going to hear that echo or not. Other thing that's important is getting RFI out of the shack, because now the computer is an integral part of your signal chain. Most of us are using these available on Amazon, Triplite, printer cables, USB A to B cables, which are shielded and double choked. This is a fancy one with gold contacts. I think it's been autographed by the designer, but most of them are around the $7 to $8 range. And I've got a whole bag of them. The other thing that's important to keep RF out of the shack is a Ballon or feed line choke. They're pretty much the same thing depending on your antenna. You can't complain at all about DX Engineering. They do a wonderful job. These things are robust. I've taken them apart. They look beautiful inside. I've had some issues with the Palomars. One of them melted on me. But DX Engineering is great. And Ballon Designs looks very, very similar inside. It's the same kind of quality, but it's one guy who's winding these things in his basement at night and shipping it to you within 3 days. So Ballon Designs is a great place. I just bought 2 of them from him, and a wonderful place to deal with. But you don't want RF in the shack. You want to make sure all the common mode current stops outside the shack. Next thing we need to talk about are the things that's absolute essential for FT8 is time synchronization. For maximum sensitivity, you need to be within half a second. Up to a second usually works pretty well. There's a cliff edge effect where at some point or another, if you're too far off, you're not going to decode anything at all. I had used Dimension 4 because that was really popular back in 2017. The problem with Dimension 4 is it resets your computer talk time in one big jump. You're a second off, jump. It's now you're a second on. And so it works just fine. But if you're decoding that one node that you're never going to hear again, you will lose that entire decoding cycle. So I've been using Mindbird NTP for quite a while at this point. FT4, because it's essentially going twice the speed, is far more intolerant of time differences. So let's go on. Again, Mindbird is my go-to. Because Mindbird changes time with very slow skewing, it can take 10 or 15 minutes if you're significantly off for Mindbird to reset your computer clock time. If you haven't been on the radio for a while and you turn it on and you don't get any FT8 decodes, it's because you're off. When you download Mindbird, and there's the NTP download from the Mindbird site. This is really easy to install on your computer. It should take you less than a minute, but they also have this little on-screen widget you can add. It's called the NTP monitor. And what that allows you to do is stop the service and then restart the service. And at that point, Mindbird will do a jump and give you the correct time. Again, very easy to do. There's a guy, M9 MDB, Mike. He has a little video. There's only one critical part to it, and that's to be sure that you've put in the right geographic locator when you download Mindbird NTP. This is something that probably all of you are aware of. You type in time.is into your browser, and you'll get the exact time and where your computer clock time lives compared to the exact time. So if there's any questions about why you're not decoding or why you're not decoding as well as other people or who's off kilter, you just type in time.is into your browser and you're set. Now, this same guy, Mike, also does time fudge. I have yet to discover why this is a smart no-fuss time zone planner. But what Time Fudge 1.4 will do is it's a ham app, and what it'll do is it will allow you to purposely incorporate an error into your computer time clock. That'll give you a decoding advantage with the DX station that doesn't have proper timing. And so I think you need a net time protocol, and you need time fudge on your computer when you're doing FT8. Now let's talk about the WSJT program itself. I'm absolutely in love with the improved version of WSJT. This is the download site on SourceForge for WSJT 3.0. It can come with a bunch of different interfaces, and you don't choose the interface from within the program. You choose the interface based on which program you download from SourceForge. So there's 3 different types. There really isn't anything to putting it in. It's got a bunch of different features, but the main feature it has is incredible decoding sensitivity and resistance to interference. But it's got a bunch of other stuff it does too. It's got mode buttons, so you don't have to use the drop down. You can just go ahead and hit the button for 40 meter FT8. It's got band hopping, so it will automatically go through several different bands. You don't have to have a flex and have different slices. It's a great program. It gets updated very quickly. And in addition, Hamlet, which is the library of programs that tells your rig how to interface with your computer, is updated automatically on the improved versions of WSJT. Whereas if you downloaded WSJT 2.7, whatever version of Hamlet you have, you're stuck with. So if you get yourself a new radio and it does not include the instructions for your new radio, you could have difficulties establishing computer control. So this is a little highlight on WSJTX 3.0 Improve. This is what I'm currently running right now. And again, make it over so I can actually read this thing. It's got superior decoding performance. This is the main sales point for WSJT 3.0, the multi-threaded FT8 decoder. It's got what they call an intelligent combination 2-3 stage decoder because it uses the single thread decoder for the first pass. It then uses that to obtain the information to do digital subtraction from that, and then it starts processing it intensively. And this is all very, very greedy of computer resources. We talked a little bit about before the little jelly frass that includes it, and then it has a whole bunch of other tools that you can use. The thing you have to understand about the multi-threaded decoder is that unlike past versions of WSJT, where you set it and forget it, this is designed to be extremely adjustable, meaning that you can tailor the program itself to how much computer power you have available and how tolerant you are of false decodes. This is the main difference, the various GUIs. This is the good old traditional GUI, where you have the band activity window, the RX window, and the WSJT main window sitting right down there. And the problem on the laptop is you don't really have a lot of room at all. If you're on the DXpedition, you may only see a third of the people that are calling you. There's a second version, which is alternative layout right here. And this has been optimized for small screens. So if you're using a laptop, this is what you want to use, because now, the most important, the band activity window is now almost twice the size. And the main window is now stuffed down on the side. There's a third, which is called, I think it's called widescreen over here. And, you can use this if you want to have, again, a huge band activity window and the main window stuffed in the corner. I've got 2 27-inch monitors, one stacked on top of the other, and I'm using the traditional layout, but because there's so much real estate on the monitors, it doesn't really make any difference. But again, especially if you're using a laptop, this second layout can be very useful to you.
Bruce, you mentioned when you started talking about the improved version, you said that when you download it, you have to pick one of these first.
Well, you have 3 different downloads at SourceForge, and each of them has a coded number. And so what you'd want to do is you'd want to download the widescreen, the alternative layout, or the one that doesn't have any label at all, which is the traditional WSJT layout. On SourceForge, the first one you see is the traditional one. Then you have one that says AL on it, which is what you should use for a small laptop computer. And then you have one labeled widescreen.
Okay.
Nothing there.
I know we're not sharing.
In that photo where I'm operating 2 stations, what was really cool to me was, as Bruce said, it was about 3 a.m. in the morning, but I was working you guys on 80 meters FT8, and I was working Europe on 10 meters FT8. I never have done that in my life. Had that broad of an opening. It was just astonishing to do 10 and 80 meters.
The closer you get to the equator, the cooler it is. And that's why I feel sorry for our poor friends up in Oregon. They have no ionization at all.
There you go. You should be on the right one.
Where am I right now?
I put you one.
Oh, you put me one ahead. Okay, now I'm really out of.
There you go.
Okay, so GUI selection, we talked about this. This is something you've got to make your decision as you download the program. Again, at this point, I think 3.0 or 3.1 is just fine. So Ron, I talked a little bit about this earlier. This is the key, the main reason you want to have one of these programs. This is what gave JTDX its initial advantage over WSJT. But the WSJT multi-threaded and low-pass decoding, first of all, uses less system resources and it works better. So this is the program to have right now. Historically, WSJT process decodes sequentially. JTAXN was the first to use parallel processing, where they used different portions of the computer, different threads to do the processing. The recorded transmission was actually in the RAM. 3.0 and improved surpassed JTDX, dividing the spectrum into up to 12 segments, with each one of those being processed by one thread. But you got to have the threads in the first place. Multi-pass decoding is a logical strategy to identify and decode the strongest signals first. Talked about that again. The single thread, or rather the single pass decoder, is used to go through the entire spectrum, and then they're split down. Think of it as an onion being peeled so that you can actually see what's at the middle of the onion, which hopefully is 3 by 0. The law of diminishing returns applies to this with a huge amount of emphasis. To get those last few decodes, you need a much, much more powerful system. And I'll talk about how to benchmark your own computer to see how well it's working and how to determine how to set up the system, because they've given you a lot of rope with these plans so that you can actually try to do so many threads that you end up decoding fewer signals.
You can set the number of threads you want.
You have a choice of either auto, or you can set the number of threads up to 12. Okay.
Will the auto determine the power of the computer that it's running them?
It's unclear. I asked Yue about this. The usual suggestion is to start either with auto or the number of threads you have in your machine. And then you see how it works. And there's a few different metrics you can use. First of all, you can have the immediate warning that something is amiss by the fact that you don't complete all of your decoding before the end of the cycle, or rather before the next cycle has started. If you're using a laptop, you can see that the display itself begins to hang up. But mainly what you're going to see is this thing is still printing, but the next cycle has already started. So the single-threaded decoder and the multi-threaded decoder actually work together. They have a shared hash table. So they talk to each other as things are going on in an effort to have those last few decodes.
Excuse me, Bruce. The people on Zoom say they can't hear you. You gotta hold the mic closer.
Hello? Oh, sorry, guys. So both the single-threaded decoder and the multi-threaded decoder work together in a multi-stage process, but they work independently of each other. And again, they communicate via a shared hash table where call signs have been reduced to a hash code so they can be rapidly processed and compared. And we'll talk about hash confusion later on. While the single-threaded decoder remains the reliable, optimized base decoder, the multi-thread decoder introduced parallel processing with up to a dozen concurrent threads all running simultaneously. This allows the software to employ more computationally intensive and sensitive decoding technologies that will be too slow for a single thread. So by selecting 2-stage or 3-stage in the drop-down decode menu, and I'll go over all those decode menus later on, the software can intelligently sequence both decoders. A priori, again, a priori is where the program uses assumptions that it's made. That if it hears you calling 3Y0 K, and then it gets 3Y0, it may make the assumption that they're calling you because you've been calling them. That's why you get false decodes to show that you've worked somebody that you really haven't. Here comes the big question. How do I determine what's best for my own setup? WSJT 3.0 Improve provides considerable flexibility. It gives you a lot of rope that you can hang yourself with. I contacted UA Risa, who's the head of the Improve group, and now the regular WSJT dev team and the Improve dev team are both one and the same. So the programs are now going to be very, very similar, with a slightly more cutting edge program being the Improve program. That's where they're going to test stuff and where they're expecting you to be a beta tester and give them feedback. So it's worth signing up for one of the shared bulletin boards. There's no single one right answer. That's the problem. So here's his letter. And I can you guys see that?
No.
Oh, okay. That's hoping too much. I can't see it either.
Oh,
Sorry, guys. Sorry. So let me quickly go through this. And if it's getting too boring for me talking about this, let me know. So again, you was a great guy. You know, I sent him an email and he sent me back a multi-page response. So he'll answer any questions you want about any of this to optimize your own system. Hi, Bruce. Both the single-threaded decoder and the multi-threaded decoder use up to 3 normal decoding passes. STD uses additional AP passes, which could theoretically also be referred to as subpasses. MTD, or multi-threaded decoder, uses this technology to a much greater extent. MTD uses up to 12 subpasses and does not only use them for AP decoding. The decoding performance when selecting use subpass. There was an issue I had with whether I should select low thresholds or use subpass. The decoding performance when selecting use subpass therefore generally exceeds the performance achieved with use low thresholds. In my experience, the intelligent use of the many subpasses ultimately yields much better results than further lowering the sync bins, which is done with low thresholds. I already optimized the sync min values as best as possible in hundreds of hours of work anyway, both for MTD and UV. The sync mins describe what tolerance you have for incomplete fits when you're looking at the timing signals within FT8. Or if you don't hear them all, you might make some assumptions. So essentially, by setting the sync mins lower, you do the same thing as you do in anything that increases sensitivity in FT8. You get more false decodes. When using MTD, it's important to ensure that your computer is powerful enough to handle this technology. Newer systems can do this without any problems. On older, less powerful computers, however, it might be advisable not to use the maximum decoder settings, but to adjust them individually with the aim of optimizing the actual decoding performance achieved. If necessary, use 2 instead of 3 individual decoding passes, or disable the subpasses, or something like that. Incidentally, this is the reason why there are so many options available under parameters. For an objective comparison on your system, and this is key, either run 2 instances of WSJT improved in parallel, or save audio files and read them with different decoder settings. I ended up doing that with my own system, and I'll tell you about it. If the peak CPU utilization is too high on systems with multiple CPU cores and threads, reduce the number of threads. Set it to just 2 or 3 instead of auto. This results in the decoding process taking a little longer, but the total CPU load is significantly lower. I use this on my computer for 2 instances that are connected to receivers that I have running in the background all day long. In my experience, it's not a problem if CPU utilization rises to 90 or even 100%, as long as the computer doesn't freeze and don't lose your decodes. CPU resources are designed to be used to their full capacity. And then he goes on and talks about the 3.1 and the changes that he's made in it. So here is the settings that yield maximum sensitivity if you have a machine that can handle this. So basically, this is obtained from the top of the FT8 page, and you have decode. And you always suggest you set to deep or deepest, depending on what you have on your particular program. Decode start, which is parameters. Yeah. So this is a decode start on my particular program.
Keep in mind, people on Zoom can't see the point.
Okay. So in the middle of the page, under parameters, you'll see decoding cycles, and we have that set to 3 stage. So that gives you the maximum sensitivity. AP decoding, again, setting AP decoding gives you a 4 decibel advantage. So again, you want AP coding to be checked. That's again, middle of the screen and towards the top. Then in terms of parameters, number of threads, in this case, I have a Dell workstation that Lucas has suggested I purchase.
Processor and how fast?
It's got a Xeon, it's got 10 cores and 20 threads. So it makes smoke when it goes really fast.
That's faster than 9.9 by
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a great computer. Thank you, Lucas. It's now 3 years old and it's working great. So I've set the maximum to 12, even though I have 20 threads. You know, the current program can only use up to 12 threads, you know, slice the spectrum into 12 different. These down here are not real important. Wideband DX call search means it looks across the entire spectrum for whomever you're calling. Hide FT8 dupe matches is again one of the artifacts that occurs with this program is you can see one station sending you 2 messages. It isn't really. It's just an artifact of the program. So that's also been checked. And is there anything else here? This is the one that is wrong under parameters. About 2/3 of the way down on the right. Under decoding sensitivity, for maximum sensitivity, you don't want to use low thresholds. That's old news. You want to use subpass. And that was what you want to use subpass.
Subpass.
Yeah, subpass right over there. And, you know, I can give you guys copies of any of this stuff that you want later on. It's being recorded.
We'll post your presentation on the website.
Okay, great, fantastic. Again, decoding cycles were under 3. Now, all of this is fine and good. I'm talking about my machine, okay? What about your machines? Because some of you guys probably have Raspberry Pis and other of you are probably using Cray computers. So Again, these are pretty much the same thing. ISAI with a Xeon processor with 10 cores, 20 threads on WSJT improved. What should I set? Decoding depth deep, MTD at 3-stage, sensitivity mode, use subpass, thread count, auto or 12, because it would be using 12 anyway. This shows just a little bit more of that. Again, this is the entire screen right here, 3.0, improved plus version, file configurations, view, filters, mode, decode. This is the one that you want to go into. And then, of course, as you click decode, you can go further into the program through parameters. This is a screenshot from the SSAO expedition. You can see everyone is happily calling KP5/NP3VI. This is the even cycle, and we're going to go over the mistakes that can be made in FT8 in a moment or two. But what's happening here? I hope nobody here knows N7RO, but what's he doing?
It's in the wrong cycle.
Yeah, he's really on the wrong cycle, and luckily, he's a kilohertz away from the KP5. But if he was right on top of them, it would be hard. Again, illustrating deep decoding parameters, decoder start, 3-stage. Once again, there's N7RO still calling away. What's happened here? Right in the middle of all those callers, there's someone calling CQ. What happened there?
You turned on their computer, got to put on a call button.
Exactly.
That's another.
They got DX fever. They saw the signal, go, oh my God, that's an ATNO, quick, and they hit transmit. They hit enable, and they forgot to put the call sign in. I'm guilty of that. I've done it.
So I'll confess to having been the UP police on occasion, and if somebody's calling on the wrong cycle right on top of me, I'll send them a message that says, QRMDX or QSY. And sometimes it works, but usually it doesn't. I'm just curious.
No.
What works?
All calling me on the repeater and telling me I'm doing that.
I've tried that. I've discovered that universally, if someone's doing that, they don't have JT alert enabled. They don't have messages enabled. You cannot send them a message. It's like just when you really want to send them a message, you can't. So again, what happens if you set your machine for too many threads? If the number of threads exceeds physical capabilities, the system spends more time switching between threads than actually decoding. And what you're going to see is, especially in a laptop, the GUI is going to become sluggish or slow down or disappear. There is very much a diminishing returns with this. If you're trying to do too much, if you're trying to increase the sensitivity too much, you actually might decrease your sensitivity and get fewer decodes. So recommendations: use auto, monitor your CPU usage, click Control-Alt-Delete, enable Task Manager, and then see what your CPU usage is doing. And if you're spiking up to 100%, you better crank things back a little bit before a piston goes through the head. Consider the system power. High thread counts are intended for fast multi-core processors. For most users, using the default or a value matching the number of physical CPU cores provides the best performance. Now, how do you check it out? Well, there's this cool feature within WSGTX that allows you to a .wave, a .wav save of each of the decoding cycles. So what you do is you basically you basically have enabled everything the way you normally would. You're busy printing out all of your calls. This was AQ7DW. You go under save, which should be marked at none, or else your hard drive is going to fill out very, very quickly. and you hit save all. And what it'll do is it'll create a separate wave file for each cycle. And this is what they look like. Right over here on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a number of wave files right there. And these wave files are described in terms of the time. So you get the even and odds, and you can kind of figure out which one is the DX and which one isn't. Now, how do you figure what to do with those? So the next step is you've now made your files. The files are over here at the right-hand side. You go into File, Open, and you navigate to whichever file you'd like to decode. Meanwhile, you've set your parameters on your machine to whatever you want to test out. And you let it decode the entire file, and you'll get a number sitting right down there at the bottom, just underneath the UTC time. And you can see right there, that's these are people calling 3Y0K. We have 65 decodes down there. So what I did is I tried this using different levels of decoding. Now, I was kind of cheating because I've got the Xeon processor. But at the same time, though, it was interesting that by reducing the intensity of the decoding, I would get numbers ranging between 60 and 66 decodes. That's all you get from this big, expensive desktop system. It's an additional 60 codes. But if one of those is your ad node, you're going to be really glad you decoded it. So by continuing to monitor the task manager and seeing how much CPU use you have, and then in addition, running different, record some really difficult decodes, weak signals, lots of signals, and then try them with different parameters. And the whole thing will take you less than an hour to do, and you can kind of figure out how your system's doing. So that's how you can benchmark your own FT8 decoding system. Any questions on that one? No. Great. Okay, now we're going to jump over. This has all been kind of a smorgasbord of digital. To WSJT and MSHV multi-stream de-expedition mode, because we've got 4 de-expeditions running right now, and we're going to have a chance to try these all out. I've been told that CY0S is using WSJT Foxhound. They used it last time. They claim to be using it now. How do you know if someone's using WSJT Foxhound or another wannabe program like MSHV? Sure, just
if I see callers being moved down to the frequency.
Well, the callers will be moved down to their frequency if they've enabled WSJT Foxhound on their own machine. But even if they're on MSHV, they'll still be moved down. So if the DX is on MSHV, the caller will still be moved down because the hound, the DXer has enabled Foxhound mode. Yes, David.
So if there's more than one stream, then it's MSHV, right?
No.
Or is that not true?
Well, no. Foxhound is good for up to 5 streams.
Oh, okay.
MSHV is good for supposedly up to 5 streams. I've seen 6 streams. There's all these little forks of MSHV. So that doesn't tell you. The only way that you know for sure that it's MSHV, if you see them replying to people that are calling below 1,000. Okay?
Oh.
And that's the only way you know. And so that's why it's so important to stop transmit while you're in the middle of this pileup, get yourself a report of who is calling, and then refer back to that, because that's good for a lot of different stuff. So comparing the two, a summary of differences between Foxhound and MSHV. Foxhound maximum concurrent streams 5, SuperFox 9, but again, that's a constant envelope. It's really can't be compared with MSHV. MSHV, this AI chart says usually 2 to 3. It can go way up. But again, because of the profound power loss that you see, in both Foxhound and MSHV. From a practical point of view, unless you're using big antennas and big power and you're nearby, you can't really get away with all that many numbers of streams. Fox frequency usage. Again, the Fox is always below 1,000, somewhere between 300 and 900, usually concentrated either between 300 and 500 or 600 and 900. Now, every once in a while, it can be good to narrow the passband to get a little bit more sensitivity if it's noisy. It isn't as helpful as you think it would be, but when it's helpful, it's really helpful. I can narrow my passband just by adjusting my passband from the front of the radio. But what I've also done is I set up two custom audio equalizer curves. And one of them gives me a peak between 200 and 600, and the other gives me a peak between 500 and 900. And I can easily just change that audio response, that equalization, and it ends up having just about the same effect. So that's another way to try to give yourself a little bit of an unfair advantage. WSJT Super Fox, again, is wideband, and you can call anywhere you want to. MSHV, you can call on any standard FT8 frequency. Now, you've got to understand that until, was it 2.4? Until a certain point about 2 or 2.5 years ago, the Fox, if the Fox gave you a report, you would then move down by benefit of your own program, moving you down on top of one of his streams. You'd be moved down below 1,000, and he would get your report. But if you were running MSHV or FT8 normal, and you gave him the report while you were sitting there at 2,500 in the waterfall, he wouldn't hear it. He would only hear reports that were below 1,000. That changed. So you have two choices now when DX gives you a report. K6EP, plus 10. And you would go back and give him an R. If you had enabled Foxhound, you'd be moved down and give him the R on top of his stream. If you had not enabled it, you'd give him the R at the frequency that you were transmitting at. He can hear it either way. But the advantage of enabling Foxhound is that presumably the spectrum beneath 1,000 is far less crowded, and there's a better chance of him hearing your report. What I found myself doing during one of these recent de-expedition, so I didn't have to keep on reselecting transmit, because your transmit watchdog times out after about 3 to 4 minutes in Foxhound, whereas you can set it for whatever you want in FT8 normal. So I would set it for 60 minutes. I would start call. It's okay, I'll explain. I would start calling when I saw a report come in. I'd give him one report at my own ambient frequency. If he came back and gave me another report, meaning he couldn't hear me, I would just manually move myself down on top of one of his streams or move myself down. And that worked every single time. So that was a good one. So I'm not trying to be a lid by setting my transmit watchdog to 60 minutes. But that way, at least you can stop and start on your own. You don't have to let the program suddenly control what you're doing, because you should be stopping the transmission every few cycles to see whether you're still in the clear, to see what conditions have changed, and to see who else is calling. Because if you see that that the Fox and the EX station has actually responded to someone, and we'll talk about that a little bit further, that might be a spot that you can move into. That might be a clear spot. Anyway, so Hound transmit area, again, Foxhound above 1,000. Joe Taylor, in his original monograph in 2018, suggested using up to 4,000. That would give us a lot more spectrum, and it would make pileups a lot more manageable. But nobody does it. You see people up at 3,100. Again, Super Fox anywhere in the FT8 spectrum, and again anywhere in the FT8 spectrum using MSHV. Colors responded to only those above 1,000 in Foxhound. We're going to talk about how you get dropped from the queue. Am I going over time-wise? We're doing okay? Okay. So, yeah, I probably have way too much information. Paul tried to warn me. We'll talk a little bit again how you get dropped from the queue, and I'll try to make it fairly quickly. MSHV can run in the so-called multi-answering, auto-answering mode, otherwise known as robo mode, meaning all you need to do is enable a CQ and grab a cocktail and go out and, look at the water. I don't think that's ham radio, but in Foxhound, you actually need to mine things. Let's move on. This is a K3NQ and his buddy Bob W7YAQ. They've been on a bunch of de-expeditions that are kind of a cross between a serious de-expedition and a vacation de-expedition, and they're both really good guys. I called Al and he gave me permission to use the part of his slide deck that describes Foxhound, which is super important, and he did a really good job of it. He's far better organized than I am. So this is what the screen looks like for the DX. And this is real important. Instead of the activity window, what you do is you get a list of stations calling you. The list of stations calling you can be arranged by distance, although by default it's arranged by signal strength. So you get the loudest station at the top or the furthest station at the top. And you can apply a whole bunch of filters to this. Basically, you can make it so that you don't see anybody from North America. I think we just saw that. We have the WSJT main window right down here, which looks pretty much the same as before. And I'll try to step over here, and you see essentially the RX activity window sitting right here. The things that are important, the things that are different than an FT8 normal, is you have a queue. So as you see these patients calling on you, you either hit enter, which moves the top guy down to that, or you double click on these guys. And so with enter, you can just move the entire queue, at least up till the maximum you have in your queue, 10. You can move them all down here and line them up. And the software is automated from that point on. Basically what it does is it selects the top person in the queue and it gives them a report. It gives them a total of 3 reports, but they remain in the good graces of the program for 2 more cycles. We'll go over that in just a sec. Everything you set up from down here in the bottom right. This is the number of people you get on your station's calling list. In this case, it's 15. Maximum dB, you don't bother with that unless you're trying to get rid of people that are using linears. So again, the Fox's station calling window, in this case, arranged by distance. You're trying to be fair and you're trying to give small pistols a little bit more of a chance. You're trying to get people that are further away. But the advantage of ranking these in the order of signal strength is that there's a much better chance they're hearing you well if you're hearing them well, and you're going to be able to have a higher QSO throughput. This is the bottom right-hand window. We saw that. This is where you have your queue. If you're at a de-expedition and you see a friend calling you, you can move that person into the queue and they'll end up down here. But if you hit Alt and double click on their call, it'll move it right to the top of the queue. So if you're trying to help the friends in your club, not only can you move them up to the top, but if they're not getting through, if they're not hearing you because you're running too many streams, you can reduce your stream numbers as well, which will make you a lot stronger and give them more of a chance of completing the QSO. I think we stopped.
Oh, they're sequencing through the.
Yeah.
More paragraphs on the right.
Yeah, that did happen on my machine. Huh. Well, anyway, so I think we've already talked about everything that goes on there. So what happens when a hound moves to in progress? And this is the thing that is so important to understand. Is you're going to waste a ton of time, and you see it every day, people just calling and calling and calling that don't have a chance of getting into contact. So the hound has 5 opportunities to complete a successful QSO. For the first 3 cycles, the fox sends a report, the thing that you're used to, you know, K6ZP -3. K6ZP -3, K6ZP -3. Andy has now gotten his 3. But Andy remains alive as he manages to get a report back to the DX within the next 2 cycles. So there's 5 chances for you to get a report heard by DX. If no reply report is received after 3 reports, the fox just moves on to the next guy. But you're within this thing called a grace period. The fox will then listen for 2 more cycles. So what happens if the hound loses or fails all 5 opportunities? The fox will not make any other attempts to call. The hound has forfeited his opportunity for a QSO. What should the hound do in this case? Start all over again, which means putting your frequency back up where he can hear you. That is putting your frequency back up over 1,000, rechecking the signal report, rechecking TX1. Because again, you don't want to be sending an RR73 and you're already stuck on the RR73. So again, set TX frequency greater than 1,000, select the TX1 field, which is your call and their call, and select enable TX. So you got to remember to do all that stuff. Hopefully the hound will reappear in the station's calling and get moved back up.
Question?
What should the hound not do in this case?
A quick question. So on that 4th and 5th opportunity, do you still continue to call on their transmit frequency?
On after
Because
the,
they will move on to someone else and someone else.
well, they moved on somebody else, but you can still continue to call, you know, on their transmit frequency. What I find is I'm afraid that two hounds are going to pile up on the same frequency. And he can hear everybody that's below 1,000. So what I'll do at that point is I'll manually move them above a set of streams, but under 1,000. So examples of what not to do. So getting here close. So here N9RC in the right-hand side middle has been sent a report of -11. He sent another report of -11 on the next cycle, and then sent another report of -11. And remember, the DX is always on the even cycle. So that means you should be on the odd cycle. Meanwhile, everything's going along just swimmingly. But N9RC finally gets with the program. Now there's been 3, 4, 5, 6 cycles when he calls back. It's too late. He's had his 5. So at this point, he keeps on calling back and going R14, but he's already timed out. He's beyond the grace period. He's got to start over again.
Can the operator override that?
No. But what the operator can do, though, and what I did when this happened, is you can see, you know, your friend that's been trying to get a hold of you, but who couldn't hear you, who couldn't get an R back to you, suddenly appear in the station's calling window. Even if he's down here, because this will be one of the later calls, you can double click. He moves over here to the bottom of the list, and then you double click Alt, and that moves him to the top of the queue. So within a few moments, you can have him back at the top of the queue. But you know, you have to do that. This is a example of a grace period that worked. So here, NE7D has gotten 1, 2, 3 reports. Okay, he's had his 3, but he has 2 more cycles for his grace period. Here's the next cycle when he's going back to the next station. And the following cycle, he calls. So now he's in the 5th cycle and he's giving R plus O3 and he gets his RR73. That's the happy one. So regular FT8 allows a bandwidth of 1 QSO per minute or 60 QSOs per hour. So with one stream, you can get a max rate of 120 because essentially you're giving a report and an RR73 at the same time. With 2 streams, you get a max rate of 240 ad infinitum. So here's an example of one stream operation. You see the yellow and the red stripes are roughly equal. That means that people are coming back to you, you're running an appropriate amount of power, people are hearing you, and you have a one-to-one correspondence. This is an example, again, the colors, you have alternating yellow and red bands. They're looking just about the same. Now, I'll show you some examples later on of when either too many streams or not enough power is being run. And now what happens is you end up with a lot more transmissions than there are people that are actually coming back to you. This is AL N6TA being worked by H40WA. You can see there's a lot of yellow here without any responses. Our antennas weren't working quite as well as they should be at H40WA, so we have a lot more yellow than we do red. But Al made his contact right there and got his RR73. In this case, we're set to 1 stream. So we really don't have any further to go in trying to make it easier for the guys that can't hear us. The people that are calling, this is again where Rick would say, and K3NQ would say, you got to be loud because you may not have enough room to display everyone. And I believe I had it set to 60 right there. But you know, there were a lot of people that would fall off the bottom. This is arranged per signal strength. So that one at the top is 13 plus 13. The one at the bottom is minus 16. Again, with the idea being that under marginal conditions, responding to the stronger people is going to give you a better QSO rate. This is a shot from, and this is a photograph of HD8 Gulf in the Galapagos. And this looks pretty good here. We have about the same amount of yellow as we do red. Person calling back. Again, very weak signals. That was some in the middle of the day, and there must have been a really high absorption because you can see that all the calling signals, you know, the strongest one is minus 14. And this is DX log, which is, you know, kind of like N1, MM, but not quite as good. So a Fox's responsibilities, properly enable the Fox mode. Don't call CQ on standard FT8 frequencies. I wish we could get that to work. Move stations from stations calling window to the queue, because in Foxhound, you have to be involved in this. You actually have to select stations and move them. You have to keep the queue as fast as possible. You've all seen examples where the queue empties out, and even though there's a million people calling, she starts calling CQ because the default call is CQ. Manage the slots to make sure that you're maximizing the QSO rate. So this is judgment. This is where you want to reduce the number of slots so people aren't hearing you. Equitably work areas of the world that are calling. And a hound responsibility, properly set up hound mode. You have verified you can hear the fox. Again, don't call someone you can't hear. You follow the hound checklist, entered fox frequency. And again, you know, the way you're told is to actually enter in all of your drop-down frequencies, all the possible frequencies the fox can use. You can tune, and you all know this, you can tune manually to that frequency. But you do want to think about locking your dial frequency at that point, because it's really easy to jostle your dial in the throw of the hunt. And at that point, you lose your chance of making your QSO. You understand how to initiate a second QSO if the first one was not acknowledged. Above all, have patience. It takes a long 3Y0. I called for 2 hours on one band. So this is kind of the summary of all the stuff you should use to be a successful FT8 guy. And I can't read it from there, but the first thing, of course, is listen. You gotta check halt transmit, and you gotta look and see what's going on. You can't just leave the rig and let it continue to call and call and call, which we see. Check the DT of the callers. They should all be pretty close to 0. If all the callers are +1, it's not their problem, it's your problem. Something's happened to your, and the main problem that happens there is that Windows time can get re-enabled during an update, like a lot of stuff, like your COM ports. And so it's important to make sure that your time is in perfect shape. As you turn on your radio, you look for a clear spot. You don't just drop down and put your frequency anywhere. So you want to listen to the exchange on both sides for a while, and you want to see if you see a clear spot to put down. But remember, that's a relatively clear spot. That's a clear spot in terms of what you're hearing, but not necessarily what the DX is hearing. So there's 2 ways you can deal with that. The first one is you've clicked off and you've looked at all the callers. So you now have a list of all the callers, and you've seen which callers are successful. If you see a successful caller, either that means that that slot is relatively clear, or he has got a much larger station than you have. What I've done is looked for callers that are getting bad signal reports, like a -18 or a -20, figuring that's got to be a slot that is clearer than others. Although remember that low signal report can also be caused by QRM. Now, Mark K3NQ came up with an interesting idea. With Beauvais, what he was doing is he was looking on PSK Reporter at stations in South Africa. And he was looking to see if he was being heard in South Africa. If he was being heard in South Africa, he figured that chances are that spot was probably pretty clear for Beauvais, because that's about as close as you can get to civilization to Beauvais. If he didn't see himself there, he would randomly try another spot and keep on doing that until he found a spot that was being monitored in South Africa. I thought that was pretty clever. So again, I had what I call my Dirty Harry technique. Listen some more. The key word is listen. Watch where callers are located in the waterfall, and then click down on them, as I said earlier, and call it that frequency. Remember again that multi-stream WSJT is always on the even cycle. If you're on the even cycle too, you're making new friends with every single transmission. The Hail Mary technique, if all else fails, see if the DX is listening above 3,000. I saw some people successfully getting 3Y0K by calling it 3,100 and 3,200. I did not have the guts to call it 3,500. While you're doing this, remember that you're putting more stress on your radio and your amp than it normally enjoys. So turn up your cooling as far as you can, turn all of your fans off. Even your radio itself, you can enable more fans. You can try to keep the temperature lower because you don't want to blow anything up. I put a note in here that the John K6YP wants you to keep your LDMOS temperatures below 60. What it really was is below 70. But in any case, most modern solid state rigs allow you to go well above 70 Celsius. I know that my full fan doesn't come on my KPA 1500 until I'm in the 80s. And that will mean a hasty and expensive repair at Alacraft. Yeah. We talked before that even with the DX running WSJT Fox sound, it's permissible to call an FT8 normal, but it gives you additional responsibilities. You have to select the right cycle to call on. You have to select the right frequency to call on, and you have to be ready to move down if they didn't hear your report. We talked again about under certain circumstances, such as high noise, reducing the passband bandwidth, or if your ALC is being triggered by a strong station somewhere on the spectrum, again, by narrowing things, you may, wait, am I the one on your spectrum, the strong station?
You're the one at NCS meter.
That's what I was afraid of.
You
And that's QRP too. But, remember, there's a bunch of different things you can do. You can turn up attenuation, making sure you haven't lost the VX station. But by reducing your passband or your audio response or both, I ended up doing both to get both A on 80. That was the only way I could get them. But it can just play with stuff and see what works. I mean, it's a hobby. It's for fun, so you get to experiment. Okay, this is what my radio looks like. Two monitors stacked on top of each other. This is the standard WSJT window. That's HRD logbook. This was Desasheo with their RDU. This is DX Summit. And so, for me, I couldn't see going back to a single monitor. So let's just go quickly through a few bloopers and then wrap it up because I've talked way too long. Bracketed non-standard call signs. We saw a lot of that with KP5/NP3VI, where you get the brackets with three dots in the middle, and you have no idea what's going on whatsoever. This is a hashed call, usually a 12-bit hashed call, of which there are 4,096 possible combination. It's very unusual for two calls who are active at the same time. They have the same hash code. We all saw this with DP1 POL and PJ5/SP9 FAH. They share the same 10 or 12-bit hash code. And so there was a lot of confusion with people starting a QSO with one and finishing a QSO with the other, because they both happen to be on the air at the same time. I think all of you are familiar with the Y of hash collisions, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But typically the hash is resolved by your system when the DX station calls a CQ and gives his call sign on Claire. It can also be resolved manually. These are FT8 collisions. It's important to recognize that your system only stores the correspondence between the hash code and the unhashed call for the session that you're on. Meaning you turn on your radio and you work in KP5/NP3VI, your system is going to remember who that is and going to recognize the hash code. But once you turn your radio off, you can turn on the next day and you're going to get brackets and 3 dots. Manual hash resolution. I think I heard someone asking about this during the DXpedition. Really simple. Basically, all you do is, first of all, whatever you put in is going to take the place of those brackets and 3 dots. So make sure you put in the right call. Okay. But it's pretty easy to determine what the right call is. All you do is, in the main window on the left, there's a spot that says DX call. You type in the DX call, and then you hit generate standard messages. And now the hash is resolved. Hopefully correctly, you put in the right call. Call entry failure, again, we already talked about this error before, where someone got really excited when they saw the DX call and they just hit enable. And they started calling CQ right in the middle of it. And in this case, they actually are calling on even. So that's not a good thing. Here we have a K6MM getting a +10 report from KP5/NP3VI, while there's a station calling another station within the even period. And what happened there again is probably someone just hit transmit on the even cycle or wasn't hearing the KP5 at all. Here's another one. Even cycle, NP3VI, K6DLC, obviously he's not hearing him. you got to watch yourself, you got to look and see whether you're on even or odd cycle. Lucas volunteered this one. This is an example of really wide stations. And there's one that's 3 kilohertz wide. What's happened here? Well, again, whoever that was not using Fagin. If your audio frequencies are low, are below, say, 1500, and you inject that audio tone at, say, 1400, the first harmonic may also be transmitted at 2800 as well. And it just gets really noisy because everything's adding and subtracting from everything else. So what Fagin does essentially is it just moves your dial frequency down so that to generate that 1400 cycle tone, you're transmitting well above 2000 or 25. So that's just important to make sure you have Fagin enabled on your radio for a clear signal. And that's probably more than enough.
That's a lot of information. Before you give this back, anybody have questions online as well?
And Bill, I want to give a shout out to K3NQ, who was my old buddy. I got my general ticket with like 60 years ago. And he's a retired engineer living in Virginia now, and I hope he's on there on the other side. Although it's really late in Virginia right now.
Somebody had a question?
Yeah, Bruce, this is Matt, K6EME. I had a question for you. A lot of the new improved has a lot of adjustments you can make to it, as you pointed out. And what you talked about seems to be adjustments to be able to do de-expedition type work where you got a crowded passband, and it's going to remove those layers and decode them. My question is, are there different settings if you are not in a crowded passband and you want to increase sensitivity like on 6 meters?
Yeah, this is something that's more in your wheelhouse than mine. I mean, presumably all these multiple decodes and subband decode is also removing noise to some degree as well. I did a little bit of reading on this, but it's most of the advantages of this have to do with very, very crowded bands, noisy bands with interference. But again, that would be a question to ask you, in terms of how can we maximize our sensitivity for VHF work? And I wish I had the answer to that one. Yes, Andy.
So I found it useful often to be in that sort of higher frequency, audio frequency range, often around 24,000-2,500, but even a little higher. And recently I've gone, 2,900. And I guess my question is, I know that the software will definitely handle anything up to at least 4,000, but using the rigs that are typically used on de-expeditions and the settings in MSHB and Foxhound that are typically used on de-expeditions, is their audio passband going to even hear those signals?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it depends on what rig they're using and how the rigs are set up. Because
That's a filter.
yeah, it depends on how the filters are set up. Because I know there were a lot of 7610s, ICOM 7610s that were in use at, was it 3Y0K or was it J51A? There's too many darn de-expeditions. But in any case, they were using 7610, which is an SDR receiver. So theoretically, you could open that wide open. And, I have an older top of the line superhead, a TS990, and I run that usually at a 4,000 hertz wide spectrum setting. So I don't have any trouble. And very frequently I see decodes at 36 and 3,700. But I think it depends on what you're doing. I own a 7300, an ICOM 7300, and I've noticed it does best along the curve you'd expect from a single sideband passband. So the old wisdom was you called the DX station at around 1,500. because they were using a sideband filter, and you'd get some relative advantage calling in the middle of that sideband filter.
If I know they're using a flex, I usually call it 3100,
And does it work?
always.
There you go. Yeah, you know, I think I might just be trying to call high out with the next position I'm trying to grab, just to see if people respond. Because there's no question that 3Y0K was responding up at 2,900 and 3,000. And many a time I grabbed them when other people were still trying.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yes, thank you.
Great talk. Thank you. Yes, good night.
Thank you very, very much. And I think a key takeaway with FT8 is if you're trying to work DX, don't call them unless you're decoding them. And if you're decoding them, double click on it, find a clear spot on the waterfall, and it will set up the timing and the time synchronization, and you're all set. Then you avoid transmitting on top of the DX.